The frost came early to Ashford County that October, creeping through the Virginia hills like a silent predator, turning leaves brittle and ground hard. Most people retreated indoors, cranking up thermostats and sealing windows against the coming winter. But for Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old veteran living in the dense woods east of Riverside Falls, there was no thermostat to adjust, no windows to seal. There was only the forest, the cold, and the weight of simply trying to survive another day. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Marcus moved through the underbrush with a pronounced limp, his right leg dragging slightly with each step. The injury was 4 years old now, a souvenir from Fallujah when an IED had turned his Humvee into flying metal and his world into permanent pain. The VA had given him a cane, some pills, and a pat on the back. The pills ran out. The promises did too. Now he carried everything he owned in a military-issue backpack that weighed maybe 20 pounds but felt like 100. He'd been living rough for 8 months, ever since the apartment fell through and the last friend stopped returning calls. Pride kept him from the shelter in town where they asked too many questions and made you sit through sermons before you could eat. Out here, in the woods, he could be alone with his thoughts and his ghosts, and God knows he had plenty of both. The sun was dropping fast, painting the forest in shades of copper and shadow. Marcus needed to find his spot before full dark, the old hunting cabin near Miller's Creek where the roof mostly held and the walls blocked the wind. He moved carefully, boots crunching over fallen leaves, breath misting in the cooling air. His leg throbbed with each step, a dull ache that never quite left but sometimes screamed loud enough to drop him to his knees. He was maybe half a mile from the cabin when he heard voices. He froze, instincts honed by combat kicking in. Slowly he moved behind a thick oak and listened. 2 men, laughing, bottles clinking, probably teenagers drinking in his cabin. It happened sometimes. Marcus closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He couldn't confront them, not in his condition, not without risking something worse than a cold night. So he turned and headed deeper into the woods, away from the cabin, away from the voices, into territory he'd avoided because it bordered the old Whitmore estate, a place locals said was cursed or haunted or just plain wrong. Marcus didn't believe in curses. He'd seen real evil in Fallujah, but he respected the woods enough to stay clear of places that felt off. The temperature was dropping fast now, and Marcus could feel the cold seeping through his worn jacket, the one with the faded army patch on the shoulder that he couldn't bring himself to remove. His hands were going numb, and his leg was screaming with each step. He'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when the first snowflakes began to fall, early even for Virginia, drifting down through the bare branches like ash from a fire he couldn't see. Marcus stopped and looked up at the darkening sky. This was bad. Really bad. He was too far from any shelter he knew. His body was already compromised from months of malnutrition and exposure, and a snowstorm in October could be deadly. He needed to find cover, and fast. He pushed forward, following a deer trail that wound deeper into the old-growth forest. The trees here were ancient, their trunks thick as cars, their branches forming a canopy that had probably stood for centuries. Marcus had been a history buff before the war, back when he still believed the world made sense. He would have appreciated these trees then, would have stopped to touch their bark and imagine all they'd witnessed. Now he just hoped they'd lead him somewhere safe. The snow was falling harder when he saw the lights. Not electric lights, those would have been impossible this deep in the woods, but the soft glow of a flashlight beam swinging back and forth through the trees ahead. Marcus's first instinct was to hide, to avoid contact like he'd done for months, but the cold was biting through his jacket now, and his leg was about to give out completely. "Hello?" a voice called out. Female, authoritative but not aggressive. "I saw your tracks. If you're out here, you need to know a storm's coming. Real one. You've got maybe an hour before it gets dangerous." Marcus hesitated, then stepped into view. The flashlight beam found him immediately, and he squinted against the brightness, raising one hand to shield his eyes. The woman behind the light lowered it slightly, and Marcus could make out her features, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a ranger's uniform under a heavy coat. "You're a long way from the trails," she said not unkindly. "Got a camp out here?" "Had one," Marcus said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't talk to people much anymore. "Occupied tonight." The ranger studied him, and Marcus could see her taking in the details. The limp, the military backpack, the hollow look in his eyes that all veterans seemed to share. Her expression softened. "You're living out here?" Marcus didn't answer, which was answer enough. "I'm Sarah," the ranger said, stepping closer. "Sarah Brennan. I patrol these woods, so if you're planning to stay, we should probably know each other." "Marcus." He didn't offer more. Sarah nodded, respecting the boundary. "Well, Marcus, I'm not here to hassle you, but that storm's going to be a bad one. Your cabin by Miller's Creek isn't going to cut it tonight, and you look like you're about done in." She paused. "There's a place, old estate on the eastern edge of my patrol area. Been abandoned for decades. Big old stone structure built into, well, you'd have to see it to believe it. Nobody goes there. Locals think it's haunted." "Is it?" Marcus asked, a hint of dark humor in his voice. Sarah smiled slightly. "Only by bad memories and raccoons, but it's solid, and it's shelter. Better than freezing to death out here." She pulled out a map, shining her flashlight on it. "You follow this trail about a mile east. You'll know it when you see it. Can't miss it." Marcus stared at the map, then at Sarah. "Why are you helping me?" Her face changed, something painful flickering across it. "My brother was Army, served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He came back different, couldn't adjust, ended up living rough like you." She swallowed hard. "Found him in his truck one morning, pills and whiskey." The words hung in the cold air between them. Marcus felt something crack in his chest, something he'd been keeping sealed tight. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." Sarah folded the map and handed it to him. "So I help when I can. Consider it penance or hope or whatever you want. Just promise me you'll make it to that estate tonight and not die in a snowbank." Marcus took the map, his cold fingers clumsy. "I promise." "Good." Sarah adjusted her pack. "I've got to finish my patrol before this storm hits, but I'll check on you in a few days. Make sure you're still breathing." She disappeared into the trees before Marcus could thank her, her flashlight beam dancing away through the falling snow. Marcus stood alone for a moment, then looked down at the map. 1 mile east. He could do that. He had to. The walk took longer than a mile should. His leg nearly gave out twice, and he had to stop every few minutes to catch his breath and let the pain subside. The snow was coming down in earnest now, thick flakes that obscured his vision and made the trail treacherous. But Marcus pushed forward, using trees for support, his military training kicking in with that old mantra, "Pain is temporary, quitting is forever." By the time he saw it, full dark had fallen, and he was operating on pure stubbornness and fading adrenaline. But when he emerged into a small clearing and his flashlight beam found what waited there, he stopped dead, mouth falling open despite the cold. The mansion rose from the forest floor like something out of a fever dream. But calling it a mansion didn't capture the strangeness of it, the impossible nature of its construction. At its center stood an oak tree so massive, so ancient, that Marcus couldn't comprehend its age. The trunk had to be 30 feet across at the base, maybe more, its bark deeply furrowed and dark with centuries. But this tree wasn't just beside a building, it was part of it, through it, the foundation of it. Stone walls wrapped around the oak's base like arms embracing a lover, rising 3 stories high with the tree trunk running up through the center like a living pillar. Wooden balconies spiraled up the trunk, built directly into the bark, their railings twisted and weathered but still intact. Windows had been carved into the tree itself, their panes long since broken but their frames preserved. And the stonework, though covered in moss and vine, showed the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to another era. Hand-cut blocks fitted so precisely that mortar barely showed. Marcus approached slowly, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this impossible structure. Who had built this? Why? And how had something this extraordinary been left to rot in the middle of nowhere? The main entrance was a door carved directly from the oak, massive and ancient, swollen with moisture but still hanging on iron hinges that looked hand-forged. Marcus put his shoulder against it and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that sounded almost alive, almost resentful of being disturbed, the door scraped inward. Darkness swallowed him whole. Marcus pulled his flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the interior, his breath caught in his throat. The entryway was circular, following the curve of the tree trunk, with a spiral staircase carved directly into the living wood, winding upward into shadow. The floor was stone, covered in decades of dust and fallen leaves that had blown in through broken windows. But beneath the neglect, Marcus could see the artistry, inlaid stones forming patterns, walls that seamlessly blended stonework and bark, and everywhere the sense that this place had been loved, carefully designed, poured full of someone's obsession. He moved deeper inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The main room opened up before him, revealing furniture covered in dust sheets that had themselves turned gray with age. A chandelier hung crooked from exposed beams, its crystals dulled but still catching his flashlight beam with faint sparkles. Old paintings lined the walls, their subjects faded but still visible. Faces from another era staring out from ornate frames, with expressions Marcus couldn't quite read. Against one wall stood a grand piano, its keys yellowed and several missing, but its basic structure still sound. Bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes lined another wall, and in the center of it all sat a massive stone fireplace built into the tree trunk itself. The hearth was cold but remarkably clean, as if someone had swept the ashes away before leaving and simply never returned. Marcus set his backpack down and exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. Outside, wind howled and snow fell harder, but inside these walls he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Safe, protected, held by something larger than himself. He spent the next hour making a cursory exploration by flashlight. The place was massive, at least a dozen rooms spread across 3 floors, all in various states of decay but remarkably intact given the decades of abandonment. He found a kitchen with old appliances and a hand pump for water that no longer worked. Upstairs, bedrooms with 4 poster beds still made, their linens rotted to fragments. A study with a desk covered in yellowed papers and journals. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub and cracked mirror. And everywhere that same sense of preservation, as if the house had been sealed away mid-life and forgotten. Or not forgotten. Hidden. Waiting. Marcus settled in the main room near the fireplace. He had no wood yet, no way to start a fire tonight, but the stone walls blocked the wind and the roof seemed mostly sound. He wrapped himself in his sleeping bag, leaned back against the stone hearth, and allowed his body to finally stop moving. The pain in his leg was a living thing now, sharp and insistent. He dry-swallowed 2 Tylenol from his nearly empty bottle and closed his eyes, trying to breathe through it. This was the worst part of every day, when he stopped moving and the pain caught up, bringing with it all the memories he'd been outrunning. Fallujah, the convoy, the blast that had lifted their Humvee like a toy and slammed it back down sideways, the smell of burning rubber and something worse, his leg pinned beneath twisted metal, compound fracture visible through torn fatigues, and the screaming, his own screaming, Jake's screaming, then just silence because Jake had stopped making sounds. Marcus's eyes snapped open, heart pounding, sweat breaking out despite the cold. He'd learned not to let himself drift into those memories, not to follow them down into the dark place where he might not come back. He focused on the present, the solid stone at his back, the sound of wind against walls, the faint creak of the tree above him as it swayed in the storm. He pulled out the one photograph he still carried, creased and worn from being handled too many times. It showed two soldiers in desert fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the invincible confidence of young men who still believed they'd make it home whole. Marcus barely recognized himself in that photo, 29 years old, fit and strong, eyes clear and full of purpose. Jake Monroe had been his best friend since basic training. They'd deployed together, fought together, planned their futures together. Jake was going to use his GI Bill to become a teacher. Marcus was going to study engineering, maybe work for the Park Service, something outdoors and peaceful. They'd been 3 weeks from the end of their second tour when the IED had ended everything. Marcus had survived with a shattered leg and shattered mind. Jake hadn't survived at all. And somehow, Marcus carrying that guilt like a stone in his chest, that had been worse than dying. The army had patched him up, given him a medical discharge with full benefits, and sent him home to heal. But healing required more than surgery and physical therapy. It required wanting to heal, believing you deserved to. Marcus had neither. He'd gone through the motions, attended VA appointments, tried to hold down jobs, maintained an apartment, but he was just a ghost occupying his own life. Then came the night terrors, the flashbacks, the moments when the present would dissolve and he'd be back in that Humvee, crushed and bleeding, listening to Jake's breathing get weaker. He started self-medicating, first with alcohol, then with whatever pills he could get. Lost his job at a warehouse, fell behind on rent, pushed away the few friends who tried to help because accepting help felt like betraying Jake, like admitting he wanted to keep living when Jake couldn't. By March of that year, Marcus was homeless. By April, he was living in his car. By May, he'd sold the car for money to eat and moved into the woods. And for the last 8 months, he'd been surviving day to day, avoiding people, avoiding help, avoiding everything except the basic mechanics of staying alive. But now, sitting in this impossible mansion built inside a tree, Marcus felt something shift. Not hope exactly, that was too strong a word, but possibility. The smallest whisper that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth surviving for. He pulled his sleeping bag tighter and looked around the room. Tomorrow, if the storm passed, he'd explore more. He'd see if he could get water flowing, find wood for the fireplace, make this place livable. Not forever. He wasn't fool enough to think he could claim an abandoned estate, but maybe through the winter. Maybe long enough to figure out what came next. Outside, the storm raged against the ancient oak and its stone cocoon, but inside, Marcus Webb, broken soldier and wandering ghost, finally closed his eyes and slept without screaming. Morning came gray and cold, but the storm had passed. Marcus woke to pale light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows, painting the dusty room in soft silver. His leg was stiff and his body ached from sleeping on stone, but his mind felt clearer than it had in months. He sat up slowly, looking around at the space with fresh eyes. In daylight, the mansion was even more remarkable. The craftsmanship wasn't just good, it was extraordinary. Every detail showed intention and care. The stone blocks were fitted with precision that would make modern builders weep. The woodwork carved into the tree itself revealed someone who understood both carpentry and reverence. This wasn't just a house, it was art. It was love made physical. Marcus stood, testing his leg. It held, though barely. He limped to the nearest window and pulled away rotting boards, letting in more light. Snow covered the clearing outside, pristine and undisturbed except for his tracks from the night before. The forest stretched away in all directions, and Marcus couldn't see any sign of civilization. He was completely alone. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it felt like permission. He spent the morning exploring more thoroughly. The kitchen had old cabinets filled with dusty dishes and cookware. The hand pump was frozen, but Marcus could see the well pipe running down through the floor. With work, he might be able to get it flowing. A shed out back, half collapsed but still accessible, held tools, saws, hammers, nails, all rusted but potentially usable. There was even a small generator, decades old and probably dead, but its presence suggested the place had once had some electricity. Upstairs, Marcus found wardrobes filled with moth-eaten clothes from another era. Men's suits from the 60s and 70s, dress shirts, ties. In the bathroom, he caught his reflection in the cracked mirror and barely recognized himself. Hollow cheeks, beard growing wild, eyes that had seen too much. He looked like a ghost already. But standing there in that forgotten mansion, Marcus made a decision. If he was going to haunt this place, he might as well make it livable. He had time. He had nothing but time. And working with his hands, fixing things, might be the only therapy he could afford. Over the next week, Marcus transformed from squatter to caretaker. He cleared debris room by room, sweeping floors and opening windows to air out decades of staleness. He found fallen branches in the woods and got the fireplace working, and the first time flames caught and heat began to spread through the main room, Marcus felt something dangerously close to joy. He patched holes in the roof using materials scavenged from the collapsed shed. He reinforced the front door and cleared snow from the entrance. He even got the hand pump working after hours of wrestling with frozen mechanisms, and when water finally gushed out, cold and rust-colored at first, then clear, he actually laughed out loud. The physical work was brutal on his leg. Every night he'd collapse by the fire, leg throbbing, back screaming, hands blistered and bleeding. But it was good pain, earned pain. Each small repair felt like stitching himself back together, like proving he could still build instead of just survive. He set snares in the woods and caught rabbits. He found a stream and collected water. He discovered wild onions and persimmons still clinging to frozen trees. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough. And in the evenings, after the work was done and dinner was eaten, Marcus would sit by the fire and read from the books on the shelves. The library was extensive: philosophy, history, art criticism, poetry. Marcus lost himself in those words, in stories from another time, in voices that carried him far from the cold woods and the war that still lived in his head. He read about ancient Rome and medieval cathedrals, about painters who'd died penniless and composers who'd gone mad. And slowly, page by page, he began to remember who he'd been before Fallujah, a kid who loved learning, who believed the world was full of wonder. It was on the 8th day that Sarah returned. Marcus was outside chopping wood when he heard footsteps crunching through snow. His hand went instinctively to the hatchet, but he forced himself to relax when Sarah emerged from the trees, waving. "You made it," she called out, genuine relief in her voice. "I made it," Marcus confirmed. Sarah approached slowly, taking in the sight of him and the changes to the property. "You've been busy. Place looks less haunted already." "Still got a ways to go." She handed him a canvas bag. "Brought some supplies. Food bank had extras. Figured you could use them." Marcus took the bag, throat tight. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She looked past him at the mansion, and Marcus could see wonder in her eyes. "I've patrolled these woods for 15 years and only been out here twice. Forgot how incredible this place is. Guy who built it was supposed to be some kind of eccentric genius." "You know about him?" "Some. Name was Theodore Whitmore. Built this crazy tree mansion back in the 60s. Lived here alone until he died in the early 80s. No family, no heirs. Estate got tangled up in legal hell, and eventually the county just let it rot. Too remote, too weird, too expensive to deal with." She looked at Marcus. "How's it feel living in a legend?" "Cold, mostly, but better than the alternative." Sarah nodded. "You planning to stay through winter?" "If I can." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I won't report you. Far as I'm concerned, this place has been empty for 40 years. If someone wants to take care of it, that's better for everyone." She paused. "But Marcus, winter's going to get worse. If you need anything, medical attention, supplies, just someone to talk to, you find a way to let me know, okay? Marcus met her eyes. Kindness from strangers felt foreign, almost painful, like touching something too hot. Okay. Good! Sarah adjusted her pack. I'll check on you when I can. Try not to die or burn the place down. She disappeared into the trees, leaving Marcus standing alone with his bag of supplies and his thoughts. He unpacked it later by the fire. Canned goods, rice, dried beans, matches, batteries, and at the bottom, a first aid kit with a note in neat handwriting. For the leg, take care of yourself. Marcus stared at the note for a long time, then carefully folded it and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cared whether he lived or died. The weight of it was almost unbearable. As November deepened and true winter approached, Marcus settled into a rhythm. He woke with the sun, worked on the mansion until his body couldn't take any more, foraged and hunted for food, then spent evenings by the fire reading or just sitting in silence, letting the peace of the place seep into his bones. The tree mansion became more than shelter. It became home. He found himself talking to it sometimes, to the walls and the ancient oak, thanking them for holding him, for giving him purpose. He knew it was strange, maybe a sign he'd been alone too long, but he didn't care. Out here, there was no one to judge him. The nightmares came less frequently. The flashbacks didn't disappear, but they lost some of their power when Marcus could ground himself by touching solid stone, by reminding himself he was in Virginia, not Iraq, that he'd survived and was still surviving. One particularly cold afternoon, Marcus was in the study examining the old papers on the desk. Most were brittle and faded, receipts, letters from the 70s, nothing important. But tucked in the back of a drawer, he found something different. A leather journal, hand-bound, its pages filled with tight, careful handwriting. The first entry was dated June 14, 1961. Today I began construction on my sanctuary. They call me mad, building a house inside a tree, but they don't understand. This oak has stood for 400 years. It will stand for 400 more, and within it I will create something that outlasts us all. Marcus flipped through the pages, reading about the construction process, the challenges and triumphs. But the journal revealed more than just building notes. Theodore Whitmore had been a man haunted by loneliness, driven by a need to create something permanent in a world he felt was losing beauty and meaning. One entry from October 1967 read, "Eleanor has been gone 3 years now. Cancer took her before we could have children, before we could fill these rooms with the life we dreamed of. I continue collecting, preserving, building. What else is there? If I cannot leave heirs, I will leave legacy." Marcus closed the journal, something aching in his chest. Whitmore had been alone too, living in this magnificent creation with only his collections and his grief for company. They were separated by decades and circumstances, but Marcus understood that loneliness, that sense of being the last person standing after everyone else had moved on. He placed the journal carefully back in the drawer and looked around the study. Tomorrow he'd continue exploring. Tomorrow he'd keep fixing and building. But tonight, as snow began to fall again outside the window and firelight danced across ancient walls, Marcus Webb allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe he'd found what he'd been looking for all along. Not redemption, not forgiveness, not healing, just a place to rest. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that turned Marcus's breath to fog even inside the mansion. But the fireplace roared most hours of the day now, and he'd sealed enough windows and patched enough walls that the cold was bearable. More than bearable. The work itself had become a kind of meditation, a way to quiet the chaos in his mind. Marcus had fallen into a routine that felt almost normal. Mornings were for foraging and checking his snares. Afternoons were for repairs and improvements. Evenings were for reading by firelight, losing himself in Whitmore's extensive library, and slowly, without quite realizing it was happening, Marcus was healing. Not completely. The nightmares still came, his legs still throbbed with every weather change, and Jake's face still haunted him in quiet moments. But the sharp edges of his grief had dulled to something he could live with. The mansion itself seemed to respond to his care. Rooms that had felt oppressive with decay now felt lived in, almost welcoming. Marcus had claimed the study as his own space, sleeping there near a smaller fireplace he'd gotten working. He'd cleaned Whitmore's desk, carefully organizing the old papers and journals he'd found. And he'd started his own journal, writing about his days, his thoughts, the small victories of getting a door to close properly or a window to stop rattling. It was therapeutic in ways the VA counselors had never managed. Out here, alone with his hands and his work, Marcus didn't have to explain himself or justify his existence. He could just be. On a gray Thursday morning in mid-December, Marcus was working on the kitchen floor. Several of the wide pine planks had rotted through where water had leaked in over the decades, creating soft spots that threatened to give way entirely. He'd scavenged replacement wood from the collapsed shed and was carefully removing the damaged sections. The work was tedious. Each plank had to be pried up without damaging the surrounding boards. The joists beneath had to be checked for rot, and everything had to be measured and cut precisely. Marcus worked slowly, his bad leg propped on a stool, using hand tools he'd cleaned and sharpened over previous weeks. He was 3 boards in when his pry bar hit something that shouldn't have been there. Instead of the hollow thunk of the crawl space below, he heard a dull, solid thud. Marcus frowned and tapped again. Same sound. He pulled up another board, then another, exposing more of the subfloor. There, hidden beneath decades of kitchen planking, was a trapdoor. Marcus sat back on his heels, heart suddenly pounding. The trapdoor was made of thick oak, its edges sealed with what looked like tar or pitch to keep moisture out. There were iron hinges on one side and an iron ring handle on the other, all of it dulled with age but still solid. And most tellingly, there was a keyhole. Not a modern lock, but an old-fashioned one that would take a skeleton key. He'd been living in this mansion for over a month and had explored every visible inch of it. But this had been deliberately hidden, covered over, sealed away. Marcus pulled off his work gloves and ran his fingers along the trapdoor's edges. The seal was still intact, which meant no one had opened this in years. Decades, probably. His mind raced. This wasn't just an old storage space someone had covered over for convenience. This was something meant to stay hidden. He thought about the journal he'd been reading, about Whitmore's obsession with preservation and his references to keeping things safe. One entry had mentioned the collection being secure and protected for the future. Marcus had assumed Whitmore meant the books and paintings visible throughout the mansion, but what if he'd meant something else? Something down here, beneath the kitchen floor. Marcus tried the iron ring, but the trapdoor wouldn't budge, locked. He sat back and looked around the kitchen, thinking. Where would Whitmore have kept the key? Somewhere secure but accessible. Somewhere that made sense. He spent the next hour searching. He checked the obvious places first. Drawers, cabinets, hooks on the walls. Nothing. Then he moved to the less obvious spots. Loose bricks in the fireplace, hollowed-out books, the undersides of furniture. Still nothing. Frustrated, Marcus returned to the study and pulled out Whitmore's journal, flipping through pages, looking for any clue. Most entries were philosophical musings or construction notes, but then he found something from March 1978. The final pieces are in place. The key rests where Eleanor's hands once rested, waiting for someone who understands. Perhaps no one will. Perhaps that's for the best. Where Eleanor's hands once rested. Marcus closed the journal and thought. Eleanor had been Whitmore's wife, dead from cancer before the mansion was even finished. What would have been hers in this house? What would she have touched daily? The piano! Marcus moved quickly to the main room, his limp more pronounced as adrenaline made him careless. The grand piano sat against the wall, its keys yellowed and dusty. He'd barely looked at it except to appreciate its craftsmanship. Now he examined it carefully, running his hands over the wood, checking for hidden compartments. It took him 10 minutes to find it. The music stand had a carved rose pattern along its edge, decorative and seemingly solid. But when Marcus pressed on one particular bloom, it clicked inward, and a small panel popped open beneath the stand. Inside was a tarnished brass key on a simple chain. Marcus's hands trembled as he lifted it out. The key was old, handmade, with the kind of elaborate teeth that belonged to serious locks. He carried it back to the kitchen like it might disappear if he moved too quickly. The key slid into the trapdoor's lock with a satisfying click. Marcus turned it, felt ancient tumblers falling into place, and heard a deep, final thunk as the mechanism released. He grasped the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than he expected, its hinges groaning in protest after decades of disuse. But it opened, revealing not a simple crawl space, but a stone staircase descending into absolute darkness. Cold air rushed up, carrying the smell of earth and stone and something else, something preserved. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and shone it down. The stairs were carved from bedrock, maybe a dozen steps visible before they curved out of sight. The walls were smooth stone, worked with tools, not natural. This wasn't a cellar dug by hand. This was architecture, intentional and substantial. Every rational part of Marcus's brain told him to be careful, to think this through. The structure could be unstable. The air below might be bad. There could be anything down there. But curiosity and something deeper, destiny maybe, or just the need to understand this place that had saved him, pulled him forward. He tested the first step. It held. He descended slowly, one hand on the wall for balance, the other holding his flashlight. The temperature dropped with each step, and the air grew thicker, older. The staircase curved to the right, spiraling down maybe 15 feet before opening into a corridor. Marcus stopped at the bottom and swept his flashlight across the space. The corridor was about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, carved straight through bedrock. The ceiling was reinforced with iron beams, and the floor was smooth stone. And most remarkably, it was dry. Whatever moisture management system Whitmore had built, it had worked for decades. The corridor stretched forward about 30 feet before ending at a door. Not a wooden door, but a steel one, institutional grade, the kind you'd see in a bank or military facility. It was painted dull gray, and there was a combination lock mechanism beside a large wheel handle, like something from a submarine hatch. Marcus approached it slowly, his flashlight beam steady but his hands shaking. This was beyond anything he'd imagined. This wasn't just a hidden cellar. This was a vault. A proper, serious, built-to-last vault hidden beneath an abandoned mansion in the middle of nowhere. He tried the wheel handle, locked solid. The combination mechanism had 4 dials, each running from 0 to 99. That was 10,000 possible combinations. Marcus could spend weeks trying to crack it and never succeed. But before he could despair, his flashlight caught something else. To the right of the vault door, built into the stone wall, were shelves, and on those shelves were wooden crates, metal boxes, and carefully wrapped bundles. Marcus moved to the nearest shelf, his heart hammering. He set down his flashlight and carefully lifted a wooden crate. It was surprisingly heavy, and when he set it on the floor and worked the nails free, the lid came off with a groan of old wood. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crackled when he touched it, was a painting. Marcus lifted it out with trembling hands and unwrapped it slowly. The painting was oil on canvas, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, depicting a pastoral scene. Rolling hills, a farmhouse, workers in a field. The style was impressionistic, the brushstrokes visible and confident. And in the corner, a signature. C. Pissarro, 1876. Marcus's breath caught. He wasn't an art expert, but he'd taken enough history classes to know that name. Camille Pissarro, French impressionist, one of the founders of the movement. If this was real, if this wasn't a copy, it was worth a fortune. He carefully rewrapped it and moved to the next crate. Inside were gold coins, hundreds of them, each in individual protective sleeves. Marcus picked one up and held it to the light. It was heavy, substantial, stamped with a date, 1889. Another showed 1902, another 1923. These weren't modern commemorative coins. These were real historical gold pieces. The next box held jewelry, necklaces, rings, brooches, all in velvet-lined cases. The gems caught his flashlight beam and threw colored light across the stone walls. Another crate held rare books, first editions sealed in protective sleeves with titles Marcus recognized. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Twain, all signed. Shelf after shelf, box after box, the collection went on. Marcus moved through it in a daze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just valuable. This was museum quality. This was generational wealth, hidden away and forgotten. But the shelves only held part of the collection. The vault itself, that massive steel door, clearly contained more. Whatever Whitmore considered most precious, most valuable, was locked behind that door. Marcus sat down hard on the cold stone floor, his bad legs stretched out, his back against the wall. He stared at the vault door and the surrounding shelves, and he tried to understand what he'd stumbled into. Theodore Whitmore had been wealthy, that much was clear from the mansion itself, but this level of collection suggested someone who'd spent decades acquiring rare items, someone obsessed with preservation. And he'd hidden it all here, beneath a mansion built inside a tree, in a vault that would take dynamite or a master safecracker to open. Why? Why build something this elaborate and then die without telling anyone? Why seal away millions, possibly tens of millions, of dollars worth of art and artifacts and just let them sit here in the dark? Marcus pulled himself up and returned to the shelves, this time looking for documents, for something that might explain. He found them in a metal box near the back. Letters, all addressed to Theodore Whitmore, dating from the 1950s through the early 1980s. He carried the box up to the kitchen, his legs screaming in protest at the climb, and spread the letters out on the floor near the fireplace. Then he began to read. The earliest letters were from art dealers, auction houses, and private collectors. They detailed purchases, authentications, and shipping arrangements. Whitmore had been buying aggressively through the 50s and 60s, paintings, sculptures, rare books, historical documents, anything of cultural significance. One letter from a dealer in New York mentioned a recent acquisition of 3 impressionist works that will complete your collection magnificently. But the tone of the letters changed in the late 60s. They became more cautious, more concerned. One from 1969 read, "Theodore, I understand your desire for privacy, but I must counsel you that removing these pieces from circulation entirely serves no one. Art must be seen, must be shared. Locking it away is a kind of death." Whitmore's responses, carbon copies kept for his records, were firm. "You don't understand the world we're entering. Chaos is coming. War, social collapse, the destruction of everything beautiful. I'm not locking art away, I'm preserving it for a future that might deserve it." Marcus read letter after letter, watching Whitmore's isolation deepen. His wife Eleanor had died in 1964, and after that his correspondence became increasingly paranoid, increasingly convinced that civilization was crumbling, and only he had the foresight to save what mattered. By the 1970s, Whitmore had stopped responding to most letters entirely. He'd retreated into his tree mansion with his collection, sealing himself and his treasures away from a world he no longer trusted. The final letter in the box was dated January 3, 1983, from a lawyer in Richmond. "Mr. Whitmore, this is my 4th attempt to reach you regarding your estate planning. Without a will or designated heirs, your property and assets will default to the state upon your death. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience." There was no indication Whitmore had ever responded, and according to Sarah, he died later that same year. The estate had gone into legal limbo, the mansion had been abandoned, and the vault beneath it had been forgotten entirely. Marcus sat surrounded by letters as firelight flickered across the pages. The picture was clear now. Theodore Whitmore had been brilliant, wealthy, and utterly alone. He'd built this magnificent mansion as a sanctuary, filled it with treasures, and then died without telling anyone what he'd hidden. But what did that mean for Marcus? He was squatting in an abandoned property, living on the edge of survival. He had no legal claim to any of this. If he reported the discovery, authorities would swoop in, claim everything, and he'd be back in the woods with nothing. But if he didn't report it, if he kept this secret, what then? He couldn't exactly sell stolen art or historical artifacts. He had no connections to black markets or shady collectors, and even if he did, wasn't that wrong? Whitmore had preserved these things for a reason, however twisted his logic had become. Did Marcus have the right to dismantle that legacy? He thought about the journal entry he'd read, about Whitmore trusting that someone worthy would eventually find the collection. But Marcus didn't feel worthy. He was a broken veteran living in abandoned buildings because he couldn't cope with the real world. What did he know about art or history or responsibility? The fire crackled, and outside, wind moved through the ancient oak with a sound like breathing. Marcus looked up at the ceiling, at the tree trunk that ran through the center of the mansion, and he thought about what Sarah had said. "You're doing more for this place than the county ever did." Maybe that was the answer. Maybe Whitmore hadn't been looking for someone perfect or educated or powerful. Maybe he'd been looking for someone who would care, who would understand that some things were worth protecting even if you'd never personally benefit from them. Marcus gathered the letters carefully and returned them to their box. Then he went back down to the vault, flashlight in hand, and stood before the massive steel door. He placed his palm against the cold metal and made a decision. He wouldn't report this. Not yet. Not until he understood more. Not until he figured out what Whitmore had really wanted, what his final wishes had been. The collection had waited 40 years in the dark. It could wait a little longer while Marcus figured out the right thing to do. But first, he needed to know what was behind that door. Over the next 3 days, Marcus became obsessed with the vault. He tried every combination he could think of. Whitmore's birth date, Eleanor's birth date, the year the mansion was built, random sequences. Nothing worked. The lock was professionally made, probably military surplus, and it wasn't giving up its secrets easily. He went through every page of Whitmore's journals, looking for number sequences, for patterns, for anything that might be a clue. He found references to dates and addresses, measurements and prices, but nothing that seemed like a deliberate code. Frustrated, Marcus expanded his search to the entire mansion. He went through every drawer, every cabinet, every hiding place he could find. He checked behind paintings and inside book covers. He examined furniture for secret compartments, and on the evening of the 3rd day in the study, he found it. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Moby Dick, a leather-bound edition that looked untouched on the shelf but opened to reveal carved-out pages. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, with 4 numbers written in Whitmore's careful hand: 42-73-16-89. Marcus stared at the numbers. They could be anything: coordinates, dates, page numbers. But they could also be a combination. He grabbed his flashlight and practically ran to the kitchen, his leg protesting every step. Down the stairs, through the corridor, to the vault door. Marcus's hands shook as he set the combination dials: 42, 73, 16, 89. Then he grasped the wheel handle and turned. It moved. Stiff from decades of disuse, but it moved. Marcus put his weight into it, and the locking bolts began to slide back with mechanical precision. 1 rotation, 2, 3. and with a final heavy thunk, the vault unsealed. Marcus pulled, and the door swung open on well-oiled hinges, releasing a rush of even colder air. He shone his flashlight inside, and his breath caught in his throat. The vault was massive, maybe 20 feet deep and 15 feet wide, carved entirely from bedrock, and every wall was lined with metal shelving, safety deposit boxes, and climate-controlled cases. In the center of the room stood a table covered with more wooden crates, and against the far wall, lit by his flashlight beam, were paintings, dozens of them hung on specially mounted racks. Marcus stepped inside, moving like a man in a dream. The first painting he approached was unmistakable even to his untrained eye. The style, the colors, the signature in the corner. Van Gogh. A small landscape, maybe a study for a larger work, but authentic, real. Next to it hung a Monet, then a Renoir, then artists Marcus didn't recognize but whose work spoke of mastery and age. Some paintings were in frames, others carefully wrapped and stored. All of them looked like they'd been pulled from museums or private collections and hidden here for safekeeping. He moved to the safety deposit boxes and opened one. Inside were more gold coins, these even older. Roman, Byzantine, medieval. Another box held historical documents, letters signed by names Marcus recognized from history books. Another contained jewelry that looked like it had once adorned royalty. On the table he found crates of rare artifacts, ancient pottery, religious relics, even what looked like fragments of illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages. Everything was labeled, dated, and authenticated with paperwork showing provenance. And in the very back of the vault, in a specially reinforced case, Marcus found gold bars. Actual gold bars, stamped with dates from the early 20th century, stacked like cordwood. He didn't know how much gold was there, but it was substantial. Hundreds of pounds at least. Marcus backed out of the vault and sat down in the corridor, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a valuable collection. This was generational wealth. This was hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art, artifacts, and precious metals. And it was all hidden beneath an abandoned mansion in the middle of Virginia woods, unknown to anyone except him. He thought about his life, about sleeping in his car, about the months in the woods eating squirrels and trying not to freeze. He thought about VA appointments where they treated him like a statistic, and job interviews where they saw his limp and PTSD and found reasons to pass. He thought about Jake, who'd never made it home at all. And now this. A homeless veteran, barely surviving, sitting on top of a treasure that could change everything. The irony was so sharp it almost made him laugh. But as the initial shock wore off, a different feeling settled in. Not excitement or greed, but responsibility. This collection represented Whitmore's life work, decades of careful acquisition and preservation. It represented history, culture, beauty saved from loss. And Marcus, through sheer chance and desperation, had become its guardian. What was he supposed to do with that? He couldn't keep it secret forever. Eventually someone would come, the county, treasure hunters, curious locals. The mansion couldn't stay hidden indefinitely. But if he reported the discovery now, before understanding what Whitmore had really wanted, before figuring out how to protect the collection's integrity, it would be scattered, sold off, divided among bureaucrats and lawyers. Marcus pulled out his battered phone and stared at it. He could call Sarah. She'd know what to do, how to navigate the legal system. But calling her meant setting everything in motion, meant losing control of the situation. He put the phone away. Not yet. First, he needed more information. He needed to understand Whitmore completely, his intentions, his wishes, his final plan. There had to be more documentation, more explanation. Men like Whitmore didn't create something this elaborate without leaving instructions. Marcus sealed the vault door, climbed back up to the kitchen, and spent the rest of the evening going through every document he'd found. He read letters, journals, receipts, anything that might explain Whitmore's mindset. And finally, just past midnight, he found it. Tucked inside the very last journal, dated December 1982, was a handwritten letter. Not sealed, not addressed, just written on loose paper as if Whitmore had run out of time. "To whoever finds this," it began, "if you're reading these words, then I am dead, and you have discovered what I spent my life protecting. Know that I do not begrudge you this discovery. In fact, I hoped for it. I hoped that someone someday would find this place and understand what I tried to do." The letter continued, "I have no heirs, no family to pass this collection to. I gathered these pieces not for personal gain but for preservation. The world I lived through, depression, war, social upheaval, taught me that beauty is fragile, that culture can be destroyed in moments of chaos. I wanted to save what I could, to keep it safe for a future that might appreciate it more than my present did." Marcus's hands trembled as he read on. "If you have found this vault, you now face a choice. You can take these treasures for yourself, sell them, scatter them to the winds, or you can do what I could not, share them. Let them be seen, studied, appreciated. Use them to build something meaningful, something that serves others. I failed in this. My fear and isolation kept me from doing what I should have done. Perhaps you can succeed where I failed." The letter ended with a single line: "The choice and the responsibility are now yours." Marcus set the letter down and stared into the dying fire. Whitmore had known. He'd known someone would eventually find the vault, and he'd left instructions, not legal ones, not binding ones, but moral ones. A challenge and a trust. Marcus thought about the past month, about how this mansion had saved him, about the peace he'd found in repairing and preserving it. Whitmore had trusted him with more than treasure. He'd trusted him with purpose. And lying in the darkness of that December night, listening to the ancient oak creak above him and feeling the weight of $265 million beneath him, Marcus Webb made his decision. He would honor Whitmore's wish. He would protect this collection, and somehow, impossibly, he would find a way to share it with a world that desperately needed to remember that beauty still existed. But first, he needed help. Real help. From someone who understood the law and could navigate what came next. Tomorrow, he would call Sarah. Tomorrow, he would begin the fight to make this right. Tonight, he would sleep on top of a secret that would change everything. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He lay in his sleeping bag near the study fireplace, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows dance across the carved wood as his mind raced through impossible scenarios. Every path forward seemed blocked by walls he didn't know how to climb. He was a homeless veteran squatting in an abandoned mansion. He had no legal standing, no claim to the property, and certainly no right to the fortune hidden beneath it. If he went to the authorities, they'd thank him for the discovery, escort him off the premises, and he'd be back in the woods by nightfall. The collection would disappear into government custody, probably sold off piece by piece to cover decades of back taxes and legal fees. But if he stayed silent, if he tried to keep this secret, how long before someone else stumbled onto it? Sarah knew he was here. Eventually, other rangers would patrol through, hikers might wander past. And there was the matter of property taxes. Someone, somewhere, had records of this place. When they decided to finally deal with it, when they sent assessors or demolition crews or developers, the vault would be discovered anyway. Marcus sat up as dawn light began creeping through the windows. His leg ached from another night on a hard floor, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. He couldn't run from this. Running was what he'd been doing for 4 years. Running from the war, from grief, from responsibility. Whitmore's letter had made something clear. This wasn't just about treasure. It was about whether Marcus Webb, broken soldier and forgotten man, had the courage to stand up and fight for something that mattered. He made coffee on the camp stove he'd been using, the bitter instant kind that tasted like memories of military mess halls. Then he pulled out the battered cell phone he kept for emergencies and stared at it. The battery was nearly dead. He'd been charging it sporadically using a small solar panel, but it had enough juice for one call. He dialed the number Sarah had given him weeks ago. She answered on the third ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. "Sarah Brennan?" "It's Marcus Webb, from the Whitmore estate." A pause, then warmth flooded her voice. "Marcus, I was planning to check on you this week. How are you holding up?" "I need your help." The words came out rougher than he intended. "Something's happened. Something I can't handle alone." Sarah's tone shifted immediately to professional concern. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" "No, nothing like that. But I found something. In the mansion. Something big." He took a breath. "Can you come out here? I need to show you something, and I need your advice about what to do next." There was a long silence. Then Sarah said, "I can be there in an hour. Marcus, whatever this is, we'll figure it out together, okay?" "Okay." He ended the call and sat in the quiet kitchen, listening to the mansion wake up around him. The ancient oak creaked in the morning wind. Somewhere above, birds nested in the upper balconies, and far below, in the darkness beneath the floor, $265 million worth of treasure waited for him to make a decision that would change everything. Sarah arrived exactly 60 minutes later, parking her Ranger truck at the edge of the clearing and walking up with a backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked concerned but steady, the kind of person who'd seen enough emergencies to stay calm through almost anything. "Show me," she said simply. Marcus led her inside and through the mansion, letting her take in the repairs he'd made, the signs of habitation. She didn't comment, just nodded approvingly at the work. Then he took her to the kitchen and showed her the opened trapdoor. "Down there," he said. "I found it 3 days ago. Been trying to figure out what to do ever since." Sarah peered into the darkness, then looked at Marcus. "What's down there?" "Everything. A vault, a collection, art, gold, historical artifacts." His voice cracked slightly. "Sarah, it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more. And I have no idea what I'm supposed to do about it." She stared at him for a long moment, reading the truth in his face, then nodded once. "Show me." They descended together, Marcus's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Sarah was silent as they walked the corridor, and when Marcus opened the vault door, he'd left it unlocked overnight, too exhausted to seal it again. She stopped breathing. "My God," she whispered. They stood in the vault for maybe 20 minutes. Sarah moved carefully through the space, examining paintings, opening crates, checking authentication documents. She'd been a park ranger for 15 years, but before that, Marcus learned, she'd studied art history in college. She knew enough to recognize what she was looking at. "This is real," she finally said, her voice shaking. "Marcus, this is all real. That's an actual Van Gogh. Those coins are authentic historical pieces. This isn't some collector's hobby. This is museum-quality preservation." "I know." Marcus leaned against the doorframe, suddenly exhausted. "Whitmore spent decades building this, and now it's just sitting here, and I'm the only one who knows, and I don't have any right to any of it." Sarah turned to face him. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." They went back upstairs, and Marcus told her the whole story. Finding the trapdoor, discovering the vault, reading Whitmore's journals and letters, understanding the old man's obsession with preservation, and his final wish that the collection be shared. He showed her the letter Whitmore had left, the one asking whoever found the treasure to do what he couldn't, make it matter. When he finished, Sarah sat quietly for a long time, thinking. Finally she said, "This is complicated, really complicated. The mansion sits on county land, which means technically anything found on it belongs to the government, but Whitmore's letter suggests he wanted it handled differently. And you've been living here, maintaining the property, protecting the collection even before you knew what it was. So what do I do?" "You need a lawyer. A good one." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through contacts. I know someone. Her name's Helen Marks. She does pro bono work for veterans, helps them navigate VA benefits and property disputes. She's tough, she's smart, and she doesn't back down from fights. Sarah looked up. But Marcus, if we bring her in, if we start making this official, there's no going back. People will know. The county will get involved. The media will probably show up. Your life is going to change completely. Marcus thought about the alternative, sealing the vault, walking away, going back to the woods and letting someone else deal with it eventually. It would be easier, safer, but it would also be cowardice, and he'd spent 4 years being a coward. "Call her," he said. Helen Marks arrived the next afternoon, driving a sensible sedan with chains on the tires and carrying a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived more legal battles than Marcus wanted to count. She was in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Sarah made introductions in the mansion's main room, where Marcus had gotten a fire roaring to ward off the December cold. Helen shook his hand firmly, then immediately got to business. "Sarah gave me the basics over the phone, but I need to hear it from you. Everything, and don't leave anything out. The law doesn't care about abbreviated versions." So Marcus told the story again, more carefully this time, including dates and details. Helen took notes in a legal pad, occasionally stopping him to ask clarifying questions. When he got to the part about the vault, she held up a hand. "Show me. I need to see exactly what we're dealing with." They went down together, and Marcus watched Helen's professional composure crack as she surveyed the collection. She examined several paintings, checked authentication papers, and made careful notes. When they returned upstairs, she was pale but focused. "Okay," she said, sitting at Whitmore's old desk. "Here's the situation. This property has been in legal limbo since Theodore Whitmore died in 1983. He had no will, no designated heirs. The estate went through probate, but because the property was remote and deemed essentially worthless, just an old mansion with no utilities and no access, the legal fees exceeded any perceived value. Eventually, the county took possession by default for unpaid taxes. "So the county owns it," Marcus said, his heart sinking. "Technically, yes, but there are complications." Helen flipped through her notes. "The county has done absolutely nothing with this property for 40 years. They haven't maintained it, haven't posted it, haven't even surveyed it properly. That level of neglect opens doors for adverse possession claims." "What's that?" "Squatters' rights, essentially. If someone occupies abandoned property openly and continuously, maintains it, and treats it as their own, they can eventually claim ownership. In Virginia, that takes 15 years. She looked at Marcus. "You've been here, 6 weeks?" "About that. That's not enough time for adverse possession, but," Helen held up a finger, "there are other angles. You've made substantial improvements to the property. You've acted in good faith to preserve a historical structure. And most importantly, you discovered assets that the county had no knowledge of. Assets that, according to Whitmore's letter, were meant to be found and shared." Marcus leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means we have leverage. The county wants the treasure? Fine. But we argue that you deserve compensation for its discovery and for the preservation work you've done. We can also argue that Whitmore's letter, while not a legal will, expresses clear intent that the collection should be handled by whoever found it. It's not binding, but it's something." Sarah spoke up. "What about the collection itself? Can they just sell it off?" Helen's expression darkened. "That's my concern. If this goes public wrong, the county will see dollar signs. They'll auction everything to cover costs and generate revenue. The collection will be scattered, its historical integrity destroyed. That would be a tragedy." "So what's the right way to go public?" Marcus asked. Carefully. Helen closed her legal pad. "First, we document everything. Every item in that vault gets photographed, catalogued, and authenticated by independent experts. We establish the collection's value and historical significance. Then we file a discovery claim with the county, establishing you as the finder and primary caretaker. And then? Then we negotiate. We propose that the collection be kept together, maybe as a museum or educational foundation. We argue that you should have a role in managing it, given your investment in preservation, and we use Whitmore's letter as evidence of intent. She paused. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. Once we file that claim, this becomes public. The media will descend. Treasure hunters will show up. County officials will start making noise. Your life as you know it ends. Marcus thought about his life as he knew it, sleeping in the woods, eating squirrels, avoiding human contact because it hurt too much to be around people who couldn't understand what he'd been through. That life was already over the moment he'd walked into this mansion. Do it, he said. File the claim. Let's do this right. Helen and Sarah spent the next week at the mansion, along with 2 authentication experts Helen had quietly brought in. A retired museum curator named Dr. Patricia Chen, and an art historian from the University of Virginia named Professor James Thornton. They worked methodically, cataloging every item in the vault, photographing it from multiple angles, and cross-referencing it against databases of known works and stolen art. Marcus helped where he could, but mostly he watched these professionals move through Whitmore's collection with reverence and excitement. Dr. Chen wept when she saw the Van Gogh. Professor Thornton discovered a previously unknown Rembrandt sketch and had to sit down for 10 minutes to compose himself. This is one of the most significant private collections I've ever encountered, Dr. Chen told Marcus on the 4th day. The historical value alone is incalculable. But what makes it extraordinary is how well preserved everything is. Whitmore knew exactly what he was doing. Climate control, proper storage, authentication documentation, it's all perfect. By the end of the week, they had a full inventory. The collection included 37 paintings, including works by Van Gogh, Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, and Rembrandt. Estimated value, $85 million. Over 2,000 historical coins spanning from Roman times through the early 20th century. Estimated value, $42 million. Jewelry and precious stones, including pieces with royal provenance. Estimated value, $38 million. Rare books and manuscripts, including first editions and signed copies. Estimated value, $23 million. Historical documents and artifacts. Estimated value, $19 million. Gold bars and precious metals. Estimated value, $58 million. Total estimated value, $265 million. The number was staggering. Marcus sat in the study while Helen presented the final accounting, and he couldn't make it feel real. $265 million had been sitting under his feet while he'd eaten canned beans and tried not to freeze to death.
Okay,
Helen said, closing her laptop.
tomorrow we file. Are you ready?
Marcus looked around the room, at the fireplace he'd repaired, the windows he'd sealed, the floor he'd cleaned. He thought about Whitmore, alone in this mansion for decades, preserving beauty because he believed the future needed it. And he thought about Jake, who'd never gotten a future at all. I'm ready. The response was immediate and explosive. Helen filed the discovery claim on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, Marcus's phone was ringing constantly. He'd turned it off after the 3rd call from a reporter, but that didn't stop news vans from appearing at the access road by Tuesday. Sarah had to close the trail and post no trespassing signs. Helen issued a statement asking for privacy while legal matters were resolved. And Marcus, who'd spent months avoiding human contact, suddenly couldn't step outside without cameras in his face. The local newspaper ran the headline, "Homeless Veteran Discovers Fortune in Abandoned Mansion." By Wednesday, it had gone national. By Thursday, Marcus's face was on morning talk shows he didn't even know existed, and strangers on the internet were arguing about whether he deserved any of the money. The county moved fast. Their attorney, A man named Richard Dalton, who wore expensive suits and looked like he'd never missed a meal, filed an immediate claim that the entire collection belonged to the county by right of property ownership. He issued statements calling Marcus a trespasser and suggesting the discovery was suspicious, hinting that maybe Marcus had stolen items and planted them. "Ignore him," Helen advised. "He's trying to rattle you. The collection's provenance is documented. Whitmore acquired everything legally, and you found it exactly as you described." But worse than the county attorney were the others who started circling. Treasure hunters showed up claiming they had maps showing other caches on the property. A developer named Martin Goss appeared, offering to help Marcus in exchange for mineral rights and development access. And most disturbingly, someone broke into the mansion one night while Marcus was sleeping. He woke to the sound of footsteps on the floor above. Every combat instinct fired at once. Marcus grabbed the crowbar he kept by his sleeping bag and moved silently to the stairs. Two men were in the study, flashlights sweeping across the walls, clearly looking for more hidden panels. "You're trespassing," Marcus said from the doorway, his voice deadly calm. Both men spun around. One was young, maybe 25, with the look of someone who spent too much time online reading treasure hunting forums. The other was older, harder, with prison tattoos visible on his neck. "This place is abandoned," the older one said. "Finders keepers." "It's not abandoned. I live here, and you're leaving. Now." The younger one looked nervous, but the older one stepped forward. "Or what, tough guy? You gonna make us?" Marcus didn't move, didn't raise the crowbar, just let the cold settle into his eyes. The look he'd perfected in Fallujah, the one that said he'd already been to hell and dragging someone else there wouldn't cost him anything. "You really want to find out?" Something in his expression made the older man reconsider. He grabbed his companion's arm. "Come on! Place is cursed anyway!" They left, and Marcus locked the door behind them, then sat in the dark for the rest of the night, crowbar across his lap, listening for sounds that didn't come. In the morning he called Helen. "We need better security," he said. "People are getting bold." Helen arranged for a security system and better locks. Sarah increased patrols in the area. But the damage was done. Marcus no longer felt safe in the place that had been his sanctuary. The pressure was getting to him. The nightmares came back with a vengeance. He'd wake up screaming, not sure if he was in the mansion or back in the Humvee, waiting for the blast. His leg hurt constantly from stress and lack of proper rest, and the looks people gave him when Sarah forced him into town for supplies, some pitying, some envious, some calculating, made him want to disappear back into the woods. "This was a mistake," he told Helen one gray afternoon in early January. They were in the study, surrounded by legal documents. "I should have just walked away, sealed the vault and left." Helen looked up sharply. "You don't mean that." "Don't I? Look at what this has cost. My privacy, my peace. People breaking in, newspapers printing lies, the county treating me like a criminal." He laughed bitterly. "I was better off invisible." "No, you weren't." Sarah had let herself in and heard the end of the conversation. "Marcus, I've been checking on homeless vets in these woods for 5 years. You know how many I've found dead? 7. Exposure, starvation, suicide. You were headed that direction. Maybe that would have been easier." "Easier isn't the same as better." Sarah sat down across from him. "You know what my brother told me in his last letter? He said he wished he'd had something to fight for after coming home. Something that mattered. You have that now. Don't throw it away because it's hard." Marcus wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because underneath the stress and fear and exhaustion, he felt something he'd lost 4 years ago. Purpose. Getting up each morning meant something. The work he was doing, fighting to preserve Whitmore's collection, to honor the old man's wish, mattered in a way that surviving alone in the woods never had. "What if we lose?" he asked quietly. "What if the county takes everything, scatters the collection, and I end up with nothing?" Helen closed her folder. Then at least you fought. At least you stood up and said this matters. That's more than most people do. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for late January. Helen warned Marcus it would be ugly. The county would bring every argument they had, would try to paint him as an opportunistic squatter with no legitimate claim. Marcus needed to be ready to defend not just his legal position, but his character. They're going to bring up your medical discharge, your homelessness, your PTSD, Helen said gently. They'll try to make you look unstable, unreliable. You need to be prepared for that. Marcus nodded. He'd known this was coming. The VA records, the failed jobs, the months in the woods. It would all come out. His entire failure of a life laid bare in court for strangers to judge. But something had changed in him over the past weeks. The work of caring for the mansion, the responsibility of protecting the collection, the daily choice to keep fighting instead of running, it had begun rebuilding something in him that Fallujah had shattered. He wasn't the confident soldier from the photo anymore. He never would be. But he wasn't the broken ghost hiding in the woods either. He was something in between, something still being built. The night before the hearing, Marcus sat alone in the study, reading through Whitmore's journals one more time. He found an entry from November 1981 that stopped him cold. I have become what I swore I wouldn't, a miser hoarding beauty instead of sharing it. Eleanor would be ashamed. She always believed art was meant to be experienced, not locked away. But fear is a powerful prison, and I have locked myself inside it along with all I've preserved. If I had courage, I would open these doors, but courage died with her, and now I can only wait for someone else to find it. Marcus set the journal down and looked around the study. Whitmore had spent 20 years in this mansion, surrounded by treasures, completely alone. He'd built something magnificent, and then let fear trap him inside it until he died. Marcus wouldn't make that mistake. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, whatever the county tried to take, he'd already won the important battle. He'd found a reason to keep living. He'd remembered how to fight for something beyond himself, and he'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about building a future worth living into. He pulled out his own journal, the one he'd started keeping in December, and wrote, "Tomorrow we fight, not for money or ownership, but for meaning. For the belief that some things are worth protecting, even when protecting them costs everything." Whitmore understood that. Jake would have understood it too. I think I finally do. He closed the journal and banked the fire. Then he lay down in his sleeping bag, not in fear or desperation, but in quiet determination. Morning would come, the battle would begin, and Marcus Webb, broken soldier and reluctant guardian, would stand his ground. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the clearing in fresh white. The ancient oak stood sentinel above the mansion, its branches reaching toward a sky full of stars that Marcus couldn't see but knew were there. And deep below, in the darkness of the vault, $265 million worth of beauty waited for someone to decide if it would stay hidden or finally see the light. Marcus closed his eyes and, for the first time in weeks, slept dreamlessly until dawn. The day of the hearing arrived cold and clear. Helen picked Marcus up at 6 a.m., bringing a suit she'd had altered to fit him, the first suit he'd worn since his military funeral detail 4 years ago. He felt like an imposter in it, but Helen insisted. "Appearances matter in court," she said. "The county's going to try to make you look like a vagrant. We need to show them a veteran who's been taking care of historically significant property." Sarah drove separately, arriving with a folder full of documentation about Marcus's time at the mansion. Photos of repairs he'd made, logs of her patrols showing he'd been living there responsibly, even statements from locals who'd seen the improvements. The county courthouse was a gray stone building in Riverside Falls, imposing and official. News vans were already parked outside, and reporters swarmed as Marcus climbed out of Helen's car. He kept his head down and let Helen run interference, but he heard the shouted questions. "Mr. Webb, do you think you deserve the treasure? Is it true you were homeless? What are you going to do with $265 million? Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Marcus expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. The county attorney, Richard Dalton, was already seated at his table, surrounded by assistants and documents. He looked confident, comfortable, like a man who'd never lost a fight that mattered. Helen guided Marcus to their table. "Remember," she whispered, "let me do the talking unless the judge asks you directly. Stay calm, stay respectful, and don't let Dalton provoke you." The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Patricia Holbrook entered. She was in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that had seen every trick lawyers could pull. She sat, arranged her papers, and looked over her reading glasses at both tables. "This is a preliminary hearing regarding the Whitmore estate and the discovered collection. Mr. Dalton, you're representing Ashford County. Ms. Marks, you're representing Marcus Webb. Let's keep this professional and efficient. Mr. Dalton, you may begin." What followed was 3 hours of legal maneuvering that made Marcus's head spin. Dalton argued that the county owned the property through tax default, that anything found on county land belonged to the county, and that Marcus was an unlawful trespasser who had no standing to claim anything. He presented documents showing decades of unpaid taxes and the default transfer of ownership. Then he went after Marcus personally. "Your Honor, Mr. Webb is a transient with documented PTSD and a history of instability. He's been living illegally on county property for months. While we appreciate his military service, that doesn't give him the right to appropriate government assets." Helen stood smoothly. "Objection. Mr. Webb's military service and medical history are irrelevant to the question of property rights and discovery claims." "I'll allow it," Judge Holbrook said. "But Mr. Dalton, please connect this to your legal argument or move on." Dalton smirked. "My point, Your Honor, is that Mr. Webb lacks the credibility and stability to be a good-faith claimant. His discovery is convenient timing, and his occupation of the property is criminal trespass." Helen's turn came, and she was devastating. She presented evidence that the county had abandoned the property for 40 years, had never posted it or maintained it, and had actually lost track of it in their own records. She showed photos of the mansion's deterioration before Marcus arrived and the improvements after. "Your Honor, my client didn't trespass on active county property. He found an abandoned structure in the woods and, exercising his rights as a citizen and a veteran in crisis, took shelter there. But he didn't just take, he gave. He preserved a historic building. He protected a collection of incalculable cultural value. The county had 40 years to care for this property and did nothing. Mr. Webb had 6 weeks and did everything." She presented Whitmore's letter, arguing it showed clear intent that the collection should be found and managed by someone who would protect it. She brought in Dr. Chen to testify about the collection's significance and Marcus's role in preserving it. And she argued that Marcus deserved compensation for his discovery and his work, even if the county retained technical ownership. "What we're asking," Helen concluded, "is that the court recognize Mr. Webb's good faith effort and grant him standing to participate in determining the collection's future. He's earned that right through his actions and his respect for Mr. Whitmore's wishes." Judge Holbrook listened to it all, taking notes, asking pointed questions of both sides. When the arguments finally ended, she sat back and looked at Marcus directly. "Mr. Webb, I'd like to hear from you. Why should this court give weight to your claim?" Marcus stood slowly, his leg aching, his throat dry. Helen had prepared him for this, but now that the moment was here, all the rehearsed answers felt wrong. He looked at the judge and decided to just tell the truth. "Your Honor, I'm not going to pretend I deserve this because I'm special or smart. I'm a broke veteran who was sleeping in the woods because I couldn't figure out how to live in the world anymore." His voice was rough but steady. "I found that mansion by accident, and I found the treasure by accident. But what I did after finding it, that wasn't an accident. I could have sold things off quietly, could have disappeared with what I could carry, Instead, I tried to do right by it, by Mr. Whitmore and his collection. He paused, organizing his thoughts. That collection isn't just money. It's history. It's beauty that some man spent his whole life protecting because he believed the future needed it. And I think he was right. I think we do need it. Not to sell off piece by piece, but to keep together, to share, to remember that some things matter more than profit. Marcus looked at Dalton, then back at the judge. I don't know if I have any legal right to that treasure, maybe I don't. But I know I'm the one who found it, and I'm the one who protected it, and I'm the one who wants to do what Mr. Whitmore asked, make it matter, so I'm asking this court to let me try, that's all. He sat down, and the courtroom was silent. Helen squeezed his hand under the table. Even Dalton looked momentarily uncertain. Judge Holbrook made notes for a long moment, then looked up. I'm going to take this under advisement. You'll have my ruling in 2 weeks. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and it was over. Outside, reporters swarmed again, but Helen pushed through them to get Marcus to the car. They drove in silence for a while before Helen finally spoke. That was good, what you said in there. Really good. Think it'll matter? I think it already has. She glanced at him. Judges are human. They respond to sincerity, and you, my friend, were very sincere. Marcus stared out the window at the winter landscape rolling past. Whether he won or lost in court, something fundamental had changed. He'd stood up. He'd fought. He'd spoken truth in front of people who wanted to take from him. And he'd done it not out of greed, but out of something deeper. A belief that meaning still existed in the world, and that fighting for it was worth the cost. 2 weeks later, Judge Holbrook issued her ruling. Marcus was at the mansion when Helen called, her voice tight with controlled emotion. We didn't get ownership, she said, but we got something better. The ruling acknowledged the county's technical ownership of the property, but found that Marcus had acted in good faith and deserved compensation. More importantly, Judge Holbrook ordered that the collection couldn't be sold or dispersed without a comprehensive plan for its preservation and public access. And she appointed Marcus as temporary guardian of the collection, responsible for working with the county to develop that plan. You're officially the guardian, Marcus, Helen said. The treasure stays together, and you get to decide how it's shared. That's what Whitmore wanted. That's what you fought for. Marcus sat in the study, phone pressed to his ear, and felt something break open in his chest. Not grief this time, but relief. Overwhelming, exhausting relief. He'd won. Not money, not ownership, but purpose. A mission that would matter. Thank you, he managed. Helen, thank you. Thank yourself, she said. You're the one who didn't run when running would have been easier. After the call ended, Marcus walked through the mansion room by room, touching walls he'd repaired, looking out windows he'd sealed, remembering the broken man who'd stumbled through these doors 2 months ago. That man was still here, still carrying his scars and his grief. But he was building something new around them, not forgetting the past, but refusing to let it be the only story. He thought about Jake, about the photo of 2 soldiers who'd believed they'd both make it home. One had. And now, finally, that one was learning how to live again. Marcus opened his journal and wrote, We won. Not the fight I expected, but the fight that mattered. Tomorrow I start building something that will outlast me. Something Jake would be proud of. Something that proves broken things can still create beauty. He closed the journal and looked up at the ceiling, at the ancient oak that held this impossible mansion in its roots. Whitmore had built a sanctuary for beauty. Marcus would transform it into something more, a sanctuary for healing, for hope, for second chances. The weight of $265 million had nearly crushed him, but the weight of purpose, of meaning, of fighting for something beyond survival, that weight made him stronger. And for the first time since Fallujah, Marcus Webb believed his future might be worth living into. The news of Judge Holbrook's ruling spread faster than Marcus could have imagined. By evening, his phone was ringing again. More reporters, but this time the tone was different. They weren't asking if he deserved the treasure. They were asking what he planned to do with it. Marcus sat in the study with Helen and Sarah, the three of them exhausted from the day's emotional weight, but knowing they needed to make decisions quickly. The judge had given him guardianship, but she'd also given him a deadline. 90 days to present a comprehensive plan for the collection's preservation and use. If he failed, the county could petition to take over. "We need to move fast," Helen said, spreading papers across Whitmore's desk. "The county's going to push back hard. Dalton was furious after the ruling. He'll be looking for any excuse to challenge your guardianship." "So what do I do?" Marcus asked. "I'm not a museum curator or a nonprofit director. I don't know how to manage something like this." Sarah leaned forward. "You don't have to do it alone. That's the whole point. You build a team, people who know what they're doing, and you lead them." Marcus looked at her. "Lead them to what?" "To whatever you think Whitmore would have wanted," Sarah said. "What do you think he was really trying to preserve? Just art and gold, or something bigger?" Marcus thought about the journals, about Whitmore's desperate need to save beauty in a world he saw falling apart. He thought about the old man dying alone in this mansion, surrounded by treasures but empty of human connection. And he thought about himself 2 months ago, broken, alone, convinced he had nothing left to offer. He was trying to preserve hope, Marcus said quietly, trying to prove that beauty and meaning still existed. But he did it wrong. He locked it away instead of sharing it, and it made him miserable. "So don't make his mistake," Sarah said. "Share it. Use it." An idea began forming in Marcus's mind, something that had been building since he'd first read Whitmore's letter. What if we used the collection to fund something that actually helps people? Not just a museum, but a place where veterans can come to heal. A retreat center, therapy, job training, community. And the museum could be part of it, showing how beauty and purpose can coexist. Helen was already taking notes. A veterans center funded by the collection. That's powerful. That's exactly the kind of plan that would honor both Whitmore's intent and your role as guardian. "Can we actually do that?" Marcus asked. "Legally?" "If we structure it right, yes. We create a non-profit foundation. The collection gets donated to the foundation, which manages both the museum and the retreat center. You serve as director, overseeing everything. The $265 million becomes an endowment, funding operations indefinitely." Helen looked up, excitement breaking through her professional demeanor. "Marcus, this could actually work. This could be extraordinary." Sarah was grinning. "My brother would have loved this. A place where soldiers can heal, surrounded by art and beauty and the woods. It's perfect." Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. But this time it didn't feel crushing. It felt right. Like every step since that first night in the mansion had been leading to this moment. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it. Let's build something that matters." They worked through the night, drafting a preliminary proposal. Helen had connections with non-profit attorneys who could help with the legal structure. Sarah knew contractors and builders from her years in the community. And Marcus, drawing on skills he hadn't used since before Fallujah, started sketching out what the property could become. Dormitories for residents, therapy buildings, workshops, the tree mansion itself preserved as both museum and community center. By morning they had a rough plan. By the end of the week they had a formal proposal. And exactly 1 week after Judge Holbrook's ruling, Marcus stood in front of the County Board of Supervisors to present his vision. The room was packed. News cameras lined the back wall. Veterans in worn military jackets filled the front rows, men and women Marcus had never met but who'd heard about his fight and driven hours to show support. And in the middle of it all sat the county supervisors, 5 elected officials who would decide whether to back his plan or fight him. Marcus wore the same suit Helen had bought him for court. His hands shook slightly as he approached the podium, but his voice was steady. "My name is Marcus Webb. 2 months ago I was homeless, living in the woods, barely surviving. Then I found shelter in the Whitmore estate. I found more than shelter. I found purpose. And I found a collection worth $265 million that had been hidden and forgotten." He paused, looking at the supervisors. "I could have kept that discovery quiet. Could have sold what I could carry and disappeared. Instead, I reported it. I worked with lawyers and experts to protect it. And when Judge Holbrook made me guardian of that collection, she gave me a responsibility I don't take lightly." Marcus clicked to the first slide of his presentation, a photo of the tree mansion as he'd first found it, decaying and forgotten. Theodore Whitmore built something extraordinary, but fear kept him from sharing it. "I don't want to make that mistake, so I'm proposing we use his collection to build something he never could, a place of healing and hope." The next slides showed renderings of the proposed Veterans Retreat Center, buildings that would house 24 residents at a time for 6-month programs, therapy facilities staffed by trauma specialists, workshops for job training and skills development. And at the heart of it all, the tree mansion transformed into a museum where the collection would be displayed, open to the public, generating revenue and inspiring visitors. The foundation would be fully funded by the collection's value, Marcus explained. We'd sell a portion to establish the endowment, but the most significant pieces, the paintings, the historical artifacts, would stay together on display, exactly as Whitmore preserved them. The property would remain in public hands but operated as a non-profit with a clear mission, helping veterans heal while preserving cultural heritage. He showed projected budgets, staffing plans, partnership proposals with the VA and local universities. Helen had helped him build a comprehensive case, and Marcus could see some of the supervisors leaning forward with interest, but not all of them. Supervisor Martin Goss, the same developer who'd approached Marcus weeks ago, was leaning back with arms crossed and an expression that said he'd already made up his mind. "Mr. Webb," Goss interrupted, "this all sounds very noble, but you're asking the county to support giving control of a $265 million asset to a homeless veteran with PTSD. No offense, but that seems like poor stewardship of public resources." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Marcus felt heat rising in his chest, but Helen had warned him about this. "Stay calm. Answer the substance, not the insult." "Supervisor Goss, I understand your concern. That's why the foundation would have a board of directors including nonprofit experts, veterans advocates, and county representatives. I'd be director, yes, but with oversight and accountability. And regarding my homelessness and PTSD, those aren't disqualifications. They're exactly why I understand what veterans need. I've been where they are. I know what it takes to come back." A voice called out from the audience, a woman in army dress blues. "He's right. I served 2 tours in Iraq. Came home broken. The system failed me until I found people who understood. We need places like what Mr. Webb is proposing." Another veteran stood. "I drove 6 hours to be here. This is the kind of program that saves lives. I've lost 3 friends to suicide since coming home. If they'd had somewhere like this—" His voice broke, and he sat down, but others stood to speak. Veterans sharing their struggles, their need for specialized support, their belief that Marcus's plan could make a real difference. The room's energy shifted, becoming less about money and more about mission. Chairman Sarah Brennan, no relation to Sarah the Ranger, called for order. She was in her 70s, a former teacher with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. "Thank you all for your input. Supervisor Goss, do you have additional concerns?" Goss shifted uncomfortably. "I just think we need to consider all options. I've been approached by a development group that would pay top dollar for the property and the collection. That money could benefit the entire county. not just veterans. A development group you have financial ties to, Helen said, standing smoothly. Public records show you own stock in Goss Development Corp., which has been pursuing this property for months. That's a conflict of interest, Supervisor. The room erupted. Goss's face reddened. That's completely... I've disclosed all my holdings. Not to this board you haven't, Helen continued, now addressing the other supervisors. Supervisor Goss approached Mr. Webb privately weeks ago, offering to help him in exchange for development rights. When Mr. Webb refused, Goss began working with County Attorney Dalton to undermine his claim. I have documentation of private meetings, financial transfers, and communications that suggest corruption. She laid folders on the table in front of each supervisor. This isn't about good stewardship of public resources. It's about personal profit. And it's exactly the kind of corruption that Theodore Whitmore feared, people scattering something meaningful for quick money. The chairman opened her folder, read for a moment, and her expression hardened. Supervisor Goss, you're recused from this vote pending an ethics investigation. Please leave the chamber. Goss sputtered protests, but the other supervisors were already nodding agreement. Security escorted him out while cameras captured everything. Marcus watched in stunned silence as the man who'd tried to steal his discovery was led away in disgrace. Chairman Brennan restored order and looked at Marcus. Mr. Webb, your proposal is compelling. We'll take it under advisement and vote at next month's meeting. But I want you to know, speaking personally, what you're trying to do here honors both Mr. Whitmore's legacy and the service of every veteran in this room. The meeting adjourned, and veterans swarmed Marcus, shaking his hand, thanking him, offering to help however they could. One older man, Vietnam era by the look of his jacket, gripped Marcus's shoulder and said, "We've got your back, son, all of us." Marcus felt tears threatening and fought them back. He wasn't alone anymore. He'd found his tribe. Over the next month, something extraordinary happened. The story of Marcus's fight and his proposed veterans center went viral. National media picked it up. Veterans organizations endorsed it. Donations started arriving, small amounts from fellow veterans, larger ones from foundations and corporations wanting to support the mission. But more than money, people arrived. Retired contractors offered to work for free. Former military engineers volunteered their expertise. A landscape architect who'd served in Afghanistan drew up plans for therapeutic gardens. A chef with 2 Purple Hearts offered to run the kitchen. The community that had once whispered about the cursed mansion was now rallying to transform it. Marcus found himself at the center of something he'd never imagined. A movement. Every morning brought new volunteers to the property. They cleared brush, repaired roads, began stabilizing structures. The tree mansion itself became a hub of activity, with experts carefully cataloging the collection while construction crews worked on adjacent buildings. Sarah coordinated everything with the efficiency of a military operation. Helen handled the endless legal paperwork. And Marcus, still limping but growing stronger every day, moved between work sites, making decisions, solving problems, and slowly learning how to lead. Not everyone was supportive. County Attorney Dalton continued fighting, filing motions and objections, trying to delay the project. But Judge Holbrook denied them one by one, and when evidence surfaced of Dalton's meetings with Goss, he was forced to recuse himself. A special prosecutor was appointed to investigate the corruption, and both men eventually faced charges for attempted fraud and abuse of office. The county board vote came in late February, on a snowy evening that reminded Marcus of the night he'd first found the mansion. He sat in the front row between Helen and Sarah, surrounded by veterans who'd become friends, waiting as the supervisors deliberated. When Chairman Brennan called for the vote, it was unanimous. The county would support the foundation, would work with Marcus to establish proper legal structures, and would deed the property permanently to the non-profit with the understanding that it would serve veterans and preserve Whitmore's collection. Marcus stood as applause filled the room, and for the first time since Jake died, he felt something like joy, pure, uncomplicated, overwhelming joy. Construction began in earnest in March. The tree mansion was carefully restored, its structural integrity reinforced while preserving every original detail. The vault was transformed into a climate-controlled gallery with state-of-the-art security. The paintings, once hidden in darkness, were professionally mounted and lit. The gold and jewelry were displayed in secure cases with interpretation explaining their historical significance. Around the mansion, new buildings rose, a dormitory with private rooms for 24 residents, a medical facility with therapy offices and treatment spaces, workshops for woodworking, mechanics, art, and computer skills, a dining hall that could seat 60, and throughout the property, walking trails, meditation gardens, and quiet spaces where veterans could process their trauma at their own pace. The budget was massive, but the foundation had resources. They sold some of the gold and duplicate coins, carefully keeping the most historically significant pieces. Corporate sponsors covered construction costs, and donations kept flowing from people who believed in the mission. Marcus hired staff carefully. His director of clinical services was a psychologist who specialized in combat trauma. His facilities manager was a retired Navy Seabee. His head chef was the Purple Heart recipient who'd volunteered back in January. And as executive director, Marcus found himself growing into a role he'd never imagined. Part administrator, part counselor, part visionary. The nightmares didn't disappear, but they came less often. His legs still hurt, but physical therapy and proper medical care helped. And most importantly, the weight that had pressed on his chest since Fallujah, the guilt, the shame, the belief that he should have died instead of Jake, began to lift. Not completely, never completely, but enough that he could breathe. One afternoon in June, as construction crews put finishing touches on the dormitory, Marcus found himself alone in the Tree Mansion's museum gallery. The Van Gogh hung on the wall before him, its swirling brushstrokes capturing a sunset that felt eternal. He thought about Whitmore standing in this same spot, looking at this same painting, and feeling only loneliness. "You would have loved this," Marcus whispered to the old man's ghost. "All these people, all this life. This is what your collection was meant for." The grand opening was scheduled for July 4th, symbolic and appropriate for a veterans center. Marcus spent the week before in a state of controlled panic, convinced something would go wrong, that he'd somehow fail at the last moment. But Helen and Sarah kept him grounded, and the volunteers kept working, and slowly everything came together. The night before opening, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked the property in the darkness, checking and rechecking every detail. The dormitory rooms were furnished and welcoming. The therapy offices were equipped and ready. The museum galleries were perfectly lit, each piece displayed with information cards explaining its history. And the Tree Mansion itself, restored to glory, stood at the heart of it all, a symbol of preservation and transformation. He ended up sitting on the front steps as dawn broke, watching the sun paint the clearing in shades of gold. A voice behind him made him turn. "Morning!" A man stood there, maybe 45, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent time in hard places. He wore a faded Marine's shirt and had the careful posture of someone managing chronic pain. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked. "I'm Thomas Riley, Marine Corps, 8 years, got out in 2010, and I've been fighting ever since." He gestured at the property. "Heard about this place. Drove 15 hours from Kentucky. Didn't know if you were open yet, but I didn't know where else to go." Marcus stood slowly, recognizing the desperation in the man's eyes. He'd worn that same expression 2 months ago. "We open officially today, but come on, let me show you around." He gave Thomas a tour as the sun rose higher, showing him the dormitory, the workshops, the therapy facilities. Thomas was quiet, taking it all in, and when they finally sat in the dining hall with coffee, he spoke with a thick voice. "I tried to kill myself 3 times. Last one was 2 months ago. Wife left. Kids won't talk to me. I've been living in my truck, And his voice broke. I'm so tired of fighting alone. Marcus reached across the table and gripped the man's hand. You're not alone anymore. That's what this place is for. You're exactly who we built it for. Thomas looked up, tears streaming down his face. You really mean that? I mean it. You're home. By 9 a.m., more veterans had arrived, drawn by word of mouth and desperate hope. By 10, the parking area was full. By 11, when the official ceremony began, over 300 people filled the clearing in front of the tree mansion. Marcus stood at a podium, flanked by Helen and Sarah, looking out at the crowd. He saw veterans in uniform and civilian clothes. He saw families, supporters, media. He saw county supervisors, including Chairman Brennan, who'd championed his cause. And in the front row, he saw the first group of residents, 12 veterans who'd been accepted into the inaugural 6-month program, including Thomas from Kentucky. Thank you all for coming, Marcus began, his voice amplified across the clearing. 6 months ago I was homeless, sleeping in these woods, convinced my life was over. Then I found this place, and it saved me, not because of the treasure hidden beneath it, but because it reminded me that beauty and purpose still exist in the world, that some things are worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth building. He gestured at the tree mansion behind him. Theodore Whitmore built this sanctuary to preserve beauty, but he did it alone, and loneliness destroyed what he was trying to save. So we're doing something different. We're building a sanctuary that includes people, that recognizes healing doesn't happen in isolation, but in community, that understands veterans don't need pity or charity, we need purpose and understanding and the chance to rebuild ourselves. The crowd was silent, listening. Marcus continued. This center will serve 24 veterans at a time, providing 6 months of comprehensive support, therapy, medical care, job training, and most importantly, community. Because I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting what broke you, it's about building something new around the broken pieces. It's about finding meaning in the survival. He looked at Thomas and the other residents. To everyone who'll walk through these doors in the weeks and months and years to come, you're not charity cases. You're not problems to be solved. You're warriors who gave everything for something bigger than yourselves. And now it's our turn to give back. Welcome home. The applause was deafening. Veterans stood, many with tears streaming down their faces. Sarah was crying openly. Even Helen, professional and controlled, wiped at her eyes. After the ceremony, Marcus led tours of the museum. People gasped at the Van Gogh, marveled at the gold, and read the story of Whitmore's lonely preservation. But what moved them most was seeing the tree mansion itself, the impossible structure that had survived decades of neglect and now served a purpose its builder had never imagined. As evening fell and the crowds thinned, Marcus found himself back in the study. His study now, though he still thought of it as Whitmore's. He pulled out the leather journal and read the old man's words one more time. Perhaps one day, someone who understands will find it, and if they don't, then at least it will be preserved, waiting. Marcus picked up his own journal and wrote, Today we opened. 12 veterans came home. Thomas from Kentucky says he hasn't slept without nightmares in 5 years. Tonight he'll sleep here, in a safe place, surrounded by people who understand. That's what the $265 million bought, not comfort or luxury, but hope. Jake would approve. Whitmore would too, I think. I finally understand what I was supposed to do with all this. Not hoard it, share it, build with it, heal with it. He closed the journal and looked around the room. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Residents would start their programs. Therapists would begin sessions. The museum would open to the public. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But Marcus was ready. For the first time since Fallujah, he was truly ready. Over the following months, the Whitmore Webb Veterans Center, they'd named it to honor both men, became everything Marcus had hoped. The first group of residents progressed through their program, some struggling, some thriving, all healing at their own pace. Thomas from Kentucky discovered a talent for woodworking and started teaching classes. Another resident, a former Army medic named Angela, began volunteering in the medical facility, finding purpose in caring for others again. The museum attracted visitors from across the region. School groups came for field trips, art historians made pilgrimages to see the collection, and every admission dollar went back into the foundation, funding the center's operations and ensuring no veteran was ever turned away for inability to pay. Marcus established traditions. Every Friday, residents gathered for a community dinner where they shared their stories. Every Sunday, there was a memorial service in the garden where residents could honor fallen friends. And every morning, Marcus walked the trails himself, greeting residents, offering presents without pressure, remembering what it felt like to be alone and broken and desperate for connection. The media continued covering the story, but the narrative shifted from homeless vet finds treasure to veteran center transforms lives. Marcus gave interviews cautiously, always redirecting attention to the residents and the mission. He wasn't comfortable with fame, but he understood it brought resources and awareness that served the cause. Not every story had a happy ending. Some residents left the program early, not ready to face their demons. One committed suicide 3 months after graduating, and Marcus spent days questioning everything, wondering what they'd missed. But Helen reminded him that healing wasn't linear, that providing support didn't guarantee outcomes, that all they could do was create the best environment possible and trust people to do the hard work themselves. By the 1-year anniversary, over 100 veterans had completed the program. Employment rates for graduates were above 80%. Suicide risk assessments showed significant improvement. And most importantly, participants reported feeling less alone, more understood, more hopeful about their futures. Marcus stood on the mansion's porch that anniversary morning, watching residents move through their routines. Some headed to therapy appointments. Others worked in the woodshop or gardens. A group practiced yoga on the lawn. And everywhere, the sense of community, of shared experience and mutual support, was palpable. Sarah joined him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She'd taken a position as the center's community liaison, coordinating with the Park Service and local organizations. "You did it," she said simply. "We did it," Marcus corrected. "None of this happens without you, without Helen, without every volunteer and donor and person who believed. But you were the catalyst. You're the one who didn't run when running would have been easier." Marcus thought about that, about the moment he'd decided to call Sarah instead of sealing the vault and disappearing, about standing in court and fighting for something bigger than himself, about choosing purpose over safety. "My brother would be proud," Sarah said softly. "What you've built here, it's exactly what he needed and never found." Marcus felt the familiar ache of survivor's guilt, but it was gentler now, tempered by purpose. "I wish Jake could have seen this," he said. "He was always better at believing in the future than I was." "Maybe he can see it," Sarah said. "And maybe this is how you honor him, by building the kind of future he believed in." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher. Marcus's legs still hurt most days. The nightmares still came occasionally. His PTSD didn't disappear just because he'd found purpose. But he'd learned to live with the broken pieces, to build around them rather than pretending they didn't exist. Helen arrived mid-morning with news. "We got another major donation, a foundation that supports veterans' causes, enough to fund the 2nd dormitory we've been planning." Marcus blinked. "Seriously?" "Seriously. We can break ground next month. That'll bring capacity up to 48 residents." Helen smiled, something she did more often now. "You're building an empire of healing, Marcus."
Not an empire, a community. But he was smiling too.
That afternoon, Marcus gave a tour to a reporter from a national magazine doing a feature on innovative veterans programs. They walked through the museum, and the reporter marveled at the collection. "It's extraordinary that all this was just hidden away," she said. "What do you think Whitmore would say if he could see what you've done with it?" Marcus paused in front of the Van Gogh, the painting that had first taken his breath away. "I think he'd say I finally understood that preservation isn't about locking things away, it's about protecting them so they can be shared. That beauty matters most when it's accessible, when it reminds people that life has meaning beyond survival." The reporter scribbled notes. "And what about you? You went from homeless to running a major nonprofit in less than a year. How has that changed you?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "It hasn't changed who I am. I'm still a veteran with PTSD, still carry scars from Fallujah, still wake up some nights thinking I'm back in that Humvee. But now I have purpose. Now I'm building something that matters, that changes how I see the future, even if it doesn't erase the past." "Do you ever regret not keeping some of the treasure for yourself? You could have been wealthy." "I am wealthy," Marcus said. "Just not in the way you mean. I have meaningful work, a community, a mission that gets me out of bed every morning. That's worth more than money ever could be." As winter approached again, marking the anniversary of Marcus's first night in the mansion, he stood once more in the study where he'd slept on cold floors and read Whitmore's journals by flashlight. The room was different now, furnished properly, heated, alive with purpose, but the essence remained the same. He pulled out both journals, Whitmore's and his own, and read passages side by side. Two men separated by decades, both broken in different ways, both seeking meaning in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. But where Whitmore had retreated into isolation, Marcus had chosen connection. Where Whitmore had hoarded beauty, Marcus had shared it. And in that difference lay everything. Marcus wrote his final entry for the year. 365 days since I stumbled into this place, desperate and dying. Today, 48 veterans call it home. Today, thousands of visitors have walked through the museum. Today, we've proven that broken things can still create beauty, that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story. I still miss Jake every day, still carry guilt that I survived and he didn't. But now I carry something else too, the knowledge that his death wasn't meaningless. That by surviving, by fighting, by building this place, I'm honoring everyone who didn't make it home. This is my mission now, my purpose, my peace." He closed the journal and walked out onto the porch as snow began to fall, soft and silent. Lights glowed in the dormitory windows. Smoke curled from the dining hall chimney. And in the distance, he could hear laughter, veterans sharing a meal, building friendships, healing together. Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the battlefield to the woods to this impossible mansion built inside a tree. From desperation to discovery to purpose. From broken soldier to guardian of hope. Anyone could stumble upon treasure if they were lucky enough. But choosing what to do with that treasure, choosing to build rather than hoard, to share rather than hide, to heal rather than merely survive, that was the real transformation. And as snow collected on the ancient oak's branches and the tree mansion stood sentinel over its new community, Marcus Webb understood that he hadn't just found Whitmore's fortune. He'd found himself. Not the version that existed before Fallujah. That man was gone forever. But something new, something forged from pain and purpose, something that could bear witness to suffering while still believing in beauty. The tree had stood for 400 years, Whitmore had written. It would stand for 400 more. And now, wrapped in its roots and branches, a new legacy was growing, one of healing, of hope, of second chances for those who'd been told they had none. Marcus limped back inside, his leg aching from the cold but his heart full. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new residents, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, in this moment, standing in the mansion that had saved him and that he had transformed into salvation for others, Marcus Webb finally allowed himself something he'd thought lost forever. Peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Not forgetting, but building despite remembering. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of something that would outlast him. A legacy written not in golden paintings, but in healed lives and restored hope. The homeless veteran who'd moved into a hollow tree mansion and discovered $265 million had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Treasure isn't what you find or what you keep. It's what you build with it that defines its worth. And what Marcus had built would shine like a beacon for every broken warrior who still searched for a way home. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of transformation, hope, and unexpected redemption. Click now to continue your journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that even the most broken among us can still build something beautiful.